I'm Nima Rajan. This should be the first day back to school after the holiday break for most Canadian students. But Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, Nova Scotia, and British Columbia have all announced COVID-19 related delays for the return of in-person learning. The targeted start date is now January 10th. Manitoba will resume remote learning on January 10th, but students won't return to the classrooms until the following week. Meanwhile, Federal Public Safety Minister Bill Blair tweeted yesterday that members of the Canadian Armed Forces will be deployed to Quebec to speed up the province's vaccination efforts. Saskatchewan's opposition New Democrats are calling on the government to delay the start of school, like other provinces are doing, due to rising COVID-19 numbers. NDP leader Ryan Maley and education critic Carla Beck are urging Premier Scott Moe and his Saskatchewan party government to delay this week's return to classrooms until next week. They're also calling for a comprehensive Omicron strategy so Saskatchewan families aren't, quote, flying blind into potential disaster. An Ontario court has awarded more than $107 million to families of 6 victims aboard a passenger jet which was shot down by the Iranian military 2 years ago. The decision was made public yesterday. It follows a May ruling that the missile strikes amounted to an intentional act of terrorism. This is paving the way for relatives of those killed to seek compensation from Iran. Ontario Superior Court Justice Edward Belobaba ruled that the missiles that shot down the Ukrainian International Airlines flight were likely fired deliberately at a time when there was no armed conflict in the area. As a result, he found it constituted an act of terrorism that would invalidate Iran's immunity against civil litigation. Ottawa has officially announced it has reached agreements in principle with First Nations partners to compensate children harmed by its underfunding of child welfare. The federal Liberal government says of the $40 billion earmarked to be spent on the matter, $20 billion will pay for compensation, and the other $20 billion will be spent on reforming the system over 5 years. BC courts are postponing in-person trials this week as they work with public health officials to update their COVID-19 safety policies. The Supreme Court is asking all lawyers and accused people with scheduled appearances this week to phone the court at the time of their proceeding to arrange a new date. The provincial court says it will be contacting people scheduled to appear this week in small claims or family court to reschedule. The court say all virtual proceedings will continue as planned. Internal government documents show Finance Department officials believe there could be sweeping implications for the economy if the Bank of Canada ever issued its own cryptocurrency. The Bank of Canada has spent years looking at whether to introduce a digital currency, but so far hasn't seen an immediate need. In one briefing note from last January, officials warned Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland that the issuance of a central bank digital currency would entail wide-reaching implications. Large parts of documents obtained by the Canadian press under access to information are redacted. This is because the Finance Department says they contain sensitive government information. BlackBerry says many of its mobile phones will stop reliably working on Tuesday. This comes after the company decommissions several of its services. The Waterloo, Ontario-based business says it is decommissioning services for BlackBerry 7.1 OS and earlier BlackBerry 10 software, BlackBerry Playbook OS 2.1 and earlier versions. BlackBerry first announced that it would end services for many of its devices in 2020. This as part of its transition away from producing phones and toward being a software company. The Wildlife Rescue Association says the extreme cold in BC is having a particularly harsh impact on birds. It says 53 hummingbirds were brought into its care during the last week of December. This represents a huge increase from the 4 brought in during the same time period a year earlier. Anne Nightingale is a volunteer and board member for the Rocky Mountain Bird Observatory based in Victoria, and she says long-term issues may arise during frequent and prolonged periods of freezing temperatures. Flags at government buildings in Newfoundland and Labrador are flying at half-mast. This comes following the death of former provincial and federal cabinet minister John Efford, who died on Sunday at the age of 77. His death prompted an outpouring of grief and remembrances from politicians across Canada. He was voted into provincial politics in 1985. This is where he served until 2001 before moving to the federal House of Commons from 2003 to 2006. All right, stay with us. We will be back after the break with a look at U.S. proposed changes to meat labeling. U.S. President Joe Biden is pushing for more competition in the meat industry as U.S. consumer prices continue to rise. However, his proposed changes to labeling rules may pose a threat to Canadian beef producers and revive an old trade dispute. The current rules say that meat raised in Canada or elsewhere can still be labeled as an American product if it is processed in the United States. This after the World Trade Organization ruled that the previous U.S. meat labeling program discriminated against Canada and Mexico. However, under the review of the Product of USA labeling rules, Canadian meat producers may face disadvantages again. Well, to tell us more about what is at stake is Mr. Dennis Laycraft, Executive Vice President of the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you.
So let's start with a quick background of this issue and what exactly is at stake in this dispute.
Well, in terms of the labeling, there's really two parts here. If you go back to the original dispute, there was mandatory country of origin labeling brought in, which really put a very heavy burden on imported livestock. And it was really about the cattle and the hogs that were being imported from Canada and Mexico. And they're being heavily discounted as a result of the additional segregation and other requirements that went on. And that's what eventually led to the WTO siding with Canada, that it was unfair treatment, and essentially gave us the chance, if the rules weren't changed, that there would be legal tariffs that could be put in place. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed. The rules were repealed, and we're seeing a properly functioning North American market now.
All right, sir. So how much of the U.S. beef supply is supported by imports from Canada in the first place?
Normally it's about 2.9% that comes in, but there's also a significant quantity that goes from the United States up into Canada. And we have about the same number of live animals that are being imported from the US into Canada as well. We actually have the largest two-way trade in beef and live cattle in the world between Canada and the US. And it really allows some of the efficiencies regionally to flow, where areas we produce more cattle, areas the US produces more cattle that are closer to our population, and leads actually to a more competitive North American market.
So why now? Why is the U.S. government pushing for changes to the labeling rules in this particular time?
I think the main thrust of what was announced yesterday is actually about more of the competitive environment in the U.S. They're looking at how do you get more medium and smaller sized plants, so you simply have more processing capacity down there. There is another process that is going that is looking at the labeling, whether it's product of the U.S. or processed in the U.S. And that has a fair bit to do with the amount of transformation that occurs in a product. It's fairly normal around the world for slaughter to convey origin, where you do have integrated markets like exist between Canada and the U.S. But, we're hopeful as we move forward that we're actually going to see a more competitive U.S. market. That's good for us as well. But at the same time, we avoid the costly mistakes for both countries. There was a U.S. study that estimated it was over the period that they studied, it would have cost the U.S. industry over $8 billion lost income as well, the way the old country of origin labeling rules were being prescribed as well. So hopefully what we see is something that strengthens both markets.
All right, Mr. Laycraft. Well, how has the pandemic itself impacted the supply chain in your industry?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think similar to the U.S., early on in April, May 2020, we saw plants having to shut down for a short period of time. Across North America, they've spent $1.5 billion in different things to protect worker safety in the plants. And since that time, we've been able to operate pretty much to full capacity. And, that's certainly allowed for a more resilient supply chain. And In both countries, we're seeing our exports grow, particularly to Asia. So it's not just, we're able to meet the demands in North America. We've been able to help fill that void around the world as well.
All right, sir, just a quick 30 seconds left here, but where can our viewers learn more about your organization?
They can certainly come to our website, www.cattle.ca. But again, one thing I always like to remind people, we have one of the greatest trade relationships in the world. We have the largest two-way trade of any two nations in the world. And quite often, Canada is the largest export market for U.S. agri-food products. It's always either Canada or China. And, we have such a great relationship that hopefully as we move forward and we look at policies, we're trying to build on the positives around those relationships.
A First Nation in Northern Ontario is requesting military assistance amid a COVID-19 outbreak that has infected half of its on-reserve population and crippled daily operations. Bearskin Lake First Nation says 174 people have tested positive. This is including people in essential jobs with administration and maintenance units for the band. Most households are quarantining and need deliveries of food, water, chopped wood, and medication. Meanwhile, Premier Doug Ford has announced that Ontario schools won't reopen to in-person classes tomorrow after all. Instead, virtual learning will resume for at least 2 weeks. This to allow time for vaccines and public health restrictions to slow the spread. Quebec City's main hospital network says it will postpone half of its surgeries and medical appointments as of Wednesday. The announcement from CHU de Québec Université Laval comes as the province faces a spike in COVID-19 patients in hospital. In another move, Quebec is loosening some curfew restrictions so people can walk their dogs after 10 at night. Quebec's COVID curfew goes from 10 p.m. until 5 a.m. Yukon's chief medical officer, Dr. Catherine Elliott, is urging the public to stay home if they feel sick as COVID-19 cases surge in the territory. Yukon reported 158 new infections since Friday. It says there are 245 active cases in the territory and a 32% test positivity rate. The territory announced new public health measures on New Year's Eve, which are set to begin on Friday. Edmonton's Animal Care and Control Center says it is not taking in healthy animals for the time being. It is asking people instead to care for any strays or licensed pets they come across. City of Edmonton spokeswoman Melissa Levat says the shelter employs a small group of highly trained veterinary staff, but 3 people have been unable to work in the past few days due to illness. However, animals that are sick, injured, or otherwise in medical distress will still be accepted by appointment. An agreement between the NHL Flames and the City of Calgary on the construction of a new arena has officially been terminated. Calgary Sports and Entertainment Corporation, which owns the team, says the agreement ended on Friday. This was when neither the city nor the corporation waived construction conditions. The company had notified the city just before Christmas of its intent to pull out of the deal. The initial estimated cost of building a new arena was $550 million, split between the two. But the price tag went up to $634 million. Ag Growth International has signed a deal to buy Eastern Fabricators, a maker of stainless steel equipment for food processors. AGI is a producer of seed, fertilizer, grain, feed, and food processing systems. Under the agreement, AGI has agreed to pay $29.25 million, plus up to an additional $15.75 million in earnouts based on the achievement of certain financial targets. Eastern has 2 facilities in Prince Edward Island and 1 in Ontario. Quebec expanded booster shot eligibility to its general adult population today. This in an effort to combat COVID-19's rampant Omicron variant. Everyone 18 and over will be able to book an appointment to receive their 3rd vaccine shot before the end of January. This as long as at least 3 months have passed since their 2nd dose. Quebecers aged 55 and up are the first group to be eligible starting today, with minimum age requirements decreasing in 5-year increments over the month. The Nova Scotia Teachers Union is asking for schools to shift to remote learning when they reopen next week. Union President Paul Wozni says teacher shortages were already plaguing schools before the holiday break. He says the union will expect staffing challenges to get worse as COVID-19 cases climb in the latest wave of the pandemic. The province's chief medical officer, Dr. Robert Strang, says he can't justify further lockdown measures as hospitalizations remain low despite record-high case numbers. Nova Scotia has expanded its eligibility for booster COVID-19 vaccinations. Public Health says anyone aged 30 and older who received their second dose of vaccine at least 24 weeks ago is eligible for a booster. Premier Tim Houston says about 92,000 booster appointments opened up and were promptly filled on Monday. Mr. Houston says he was impressed by the response and that more appointments are coming up. 66 years ago today, a passenger ferry made the trip between Nova Scotia and Maine for the first time. Nova Scotia's Maritime Museum says the MV Blue Nose began its service between Yarmouth, Nova Scotia and Bar Harbor, Maine on January 4, 1956. The vessel was then operated by Canadian National Railways. It could carry up to 615 passengers, 115 cars, and 18 trucks. All right, stay tuned. We'll be back after the break with a look at news from around the world. The NATO alliance will hold a virtual meeting of foreign ministers from the 30 member nations on Friday. This to assess the situation in Ukraine and upcoming talks with Russia. The extraordinary meeting of the alliance members announced Tuesday will kick off a week of intense diplomacy. This is over Russia's buildup on Ukraine's borders and initiatives to the tension between the Cold War foes. Residents of the Chinese city of Xi'an are straining under a strict coronavirus lockdown, with some complaining that food is hard to find. That's despite assurances from authorities that necessities will be provided for the 13 million people largely confined in their homes. The lockdown, imposed December 23rd in Xi'an, is one of the harshest in the country since a shutdown in 2020. And the lockdown comes at a particularly sensitive time as Chinese authorities prepare to hold the Beijing Winter Olympics. A new poll shows that a year after the deadly January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, only about 4 in 10 Republicans recall the attack as very violent or extremely violent. The poll by the Associated Press Nork Center for Public Affairs Research found those views are a distinct minority. Overall, about 2/3 of Americans, including 9 of every 10 Democrats, describe the day as very or extremely violent. The percentage of Americans who blame the former president for the January 6th riot has grown over the past year, although that number includes only a small percentage of Republicans. People in Sudan are continuing to take to the streets in anti-coup protests following the prime minister's resignation earlier this week. The premier was ousted in the October coup, only to be reinstated a month later following a deal with the military, which was meant to calm tensions and anti-coup protests. He stepped down on Sunday amid political deadlock, saying he had failed to find a compromise between the ruling generals and the pro-democracy movement. Sudan has been politically paralyzed since the military takeover. Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam says the recent closure of 2 media outlets in the city cannot be associated with the state of media freedoms in Hong Kong, as the decisions were made by the outlets themselves. Her comments came almost a week after authorities arrested 7 people. This is including Canadian singer Denise Ho, who is associated with pro-democracy online news outlet Stand News. Days later, another online site, Citizen News, also said that it would stop operating. OPEC and allied oil-producing countries have decided to pump more oil into the world economy. The 23-member OPEC alliance, led by oil cartel member Saudi Arabia and non-member Russia, says it would add 400,000 barrels per day in February. This sticks with a roadmap to slowly restore cuts in output made during the pandemic. There were deep reductions in 2020 amid pandemic lockdowns and travel restrictions. Officials say help is on the way to hundreds of motorists who spent a chilly night snowed in along on Interstate 95. This was after a crash involving 6 tractor trailers in Virginia. Monday's accident shut down the U.S. East Coast's main north-south highway for about 80 kilometers, and it stranded drivers in both directions for more than 15 hours. By Tuesday morning, a single lane of traffic had opened up in one direction. A troubled Chinese real estate developer struggling with $310 billion in debt has suffered a new blow after it was ordered to demolish a 39-building resort complex. An order reported by Chinese media says Evergrande Group was found to have improperly built the project in Danzhou, a city on the island province of Hainan in the South China Sea, and was given 10 days to demolish it. Evergrande Group asked Monday for trading of its shares in Hong Kong to be suspended pending an announcement. Evergrande warned last month that it might run out of cash to keep up with debt payments. The European Union is imposing restrictions on the inks that tattoo artists can use as of Wednesday. The EU says it is a necessary move to protect the health of consumers. This is because thousands of chemical elements now in use can cause anything from allergic reactions to cancer. The tattoo industry is complaining that it is unfairly targeted and that it's losing an essential aspect of its art. An athletic Hungarian farm dog and a tiny pet of bygone Russian aristocrats are the latest breeds to join the American Kennel Club's purebred lineup. The club announced it's recognizing the Russian Toy and the Moody. The AKC is the United States' oldest purebred dog registry and recognizes 199 breeds, including the 2 newcomers. All right, I'm Nima Rajat, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you can always visit our website or follow us on social media. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.